So I'm going to talk today. I kind of expanded the topic a little bit. This was a talk about Linux and getting Linux and installing it instead of a traditional operating system. But I expanded it a little bit because I wanted to kind of broaden it to freedom technologies in general. So quick poll here. How many are familiar with the idea of open source at all? Okay, most of you. Wow, that's really cool. Really cool to see that. And how many of you have used open source technology of any kind? Okay, it's a little bit of a trick question because you probably all have. And I'm going to show you why that is. So just quickly, this might be hard to read. The topics we're going to run through tonight, principles, first things, open source, hardware, networks and hosting, operating systems, software, money, migration, and then I'll leave time for questions. If you do need something clarified, please just shout it out, but I will leave as much time as I can at the end for questions. I have quite a few slides here, but I'm going to try and kind of power through them here. Very briefly, about who I am, just so that you think maybe I have some accolades and maybe for my ego a little bit. My name is David Croisant. I've been using open source and freedom technologies for about 15 years. I've been in the Bitcoin space for about a decade, and currently I'm working at Start9 Labs to arm the people with tools to kind of help folks to declare their digital independence and take sovereignty over their digital tools. Principles. I like to start. I like to go in order. Obviously things go in an order when you're giving a talk, but when we talk about principles, this comes from the Latin principium, meaning a beginning, origin, or a foundation. And this is what you're going to build everything else from. So I like to start with these ideas of first things. And reason is, only from principles can we build a solid structure of any kind, right? If you're literally got a deck of playing cards that you lay out underneath of your home, it's going to collapse, right? So we got to start with these ideas, these founding ideas, before we can go any further. So what I'm going to talk, or what I want to stress is that technologies that are built with freedom into the foundation, that are part of the idea when the technology is being built, is very important, as opposed to the idea of kind of patching up what we already have because we've become used to it or because it's convenient. So one of those built-in principles is the idea of user choice, the ability of the user of some kind of technology to have maximum free will to do as they wish with their technology. Another idea is that trust by the user in some other party needs to be voluntary. So if I want to start a conversation with somebody, that is my choice and the choice of the other party, and it should not be someone else's choice that we can initiate that conversation with each other. And another thought here is accessibility. Tonight we're going to be talking a lot about computing and resources, but that also might mean cost or availability, supply lines, things like that. So basically the ability of folks to get to a technology. So what's the problem anyway? Well, if you completely trust Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Google, Netflix, Comcast, Verizon, AT&T, CenturyLink, the CIA, FBI, IRS, NSA, the FCC, and anyone else that you can think of, first of all, raise your hand. No one. Are there any public servants in the house? Is there any police officers, agents of any kind of public institution?
Say it now.
Okay, you have failed to identify yourself. Everyone in here is a witness to that. But if you believe this, then there is no problem, and you can go home or have dinner or whatever, and then there's nothing to worry about here. Just one of many headlines that we might see on a daily basis, unfortunately. Former NSA Chief Keith Alexander, who lied about mass surveillance, this was during the Snowden revelations, joins Amazon's board. This is why I like to call government and corporations GovCorp, because they're so blended together that it's very difficult to tell the difference between the two anymore. Subtitle here if you can't see it. The former Army general is personally responsible for the unlawful mass surveillance programs that caused the global scandal, says NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden. So, in my opinion, and maybe you'll agree with me, this is the problem. Okay, open source. What is open source? Thankfully, most of you know what open source is, but let's start with what is closed source. Closed source is often referred to as proprietary. And I'm not putting any, I'm just using these are kind of typically used as adjectives like open source software, closed source software, hardware. In this case, I'm going to try and take a very general approach in this introduction. So very general, high-level definition here. Closed source or proprietary is an idea of something that an author owns all the rights to use, modify, and copy. This is often going to include access. That sentence isn't right. Access and control to designs and use, even if that is free, as in beer, not free as in freedom. So even if a service is provided to you at no monetary cost, that thing might still be under the control of its author. And you can think of like Google Cloud, for example. When you make an account with Google, that's typically going to cost you no money, at least for an introductory or a free level account. However, you don't control that account. That account belongs to someone else. And this is based in control. So these are some examples. This image actually had a Red Hat image down here, which is an open source company, so I had to edit that out. But you get the gist here. All of these companies are going to have some kind of proprietary processes, software, construction methods, whatever it is that they hold to themselves, sometimes secretively or sometimes just under some kind of licensing scheme. So this is a very traditional idea, at least in the Western world, of how to build a business. What is open source? So this is something that can be modified because its design is publicly accessible. Now, this can be basically literally anything, and this is based in freedom because it's something that you can look at and change to your will. My favorite example of something that is open source, we have here a recipe book. So the idea of a recipe is generally an open source idea, right? You might have a grandmother in the family, for example, that made a loaf of bread with a particular set of ingredients and perhaps handed down the recipe for that loaf of bread amongst family members who may have edited it to their tastes. They might have added a little bit of some seasoning or some more salt or removed something. They might have shared that with other friends who could then change it to their tastes. And they might have done this free of charge, or they might also have put it into a recipe book and sold that recipe book at a cost. So open source doesn't necessarily mean free as in beer. It just means free as in freedom. So when you hand somebody the directions on how to do something, they have the ability to change that however they want. So another idea you could think of is libertarians probably like to talk about roads. Generally, we as a species know how to build roads, right? So we don't actually require any third party to license us the ability to do so. Obviously, you want to have respect for property rights and things of that nature, but hardware. This is the most difficult part of my presentation because in the open source movement, we are struggling right now in the hardware department. However, the groundwork's been laid and traction's starting to pick up in this area. What we have here is, it's probably tough to see from the back. This is a clean room. You can see a guy here in a suit to keep all dust and contamination out of the room. And this is actually a manufacturing facility for computer chips. And what I'm getting across here is that this is the hardest part of technological freedom. Do you see what I did there? It's hardware, hardest part, okay. So computers, hardware is the thing that you can touch in your hand. So generally today, what I'm talking about with freedom technologies is going to be computing technologies. And so hardware, when we're talking about computers, mobile devices, peripherals, Internet of Things, things like that. So this is the stuff like my laptop here that I can actually touch and feel. This microphone is another example. And the difficult part is, as I'm illustrating with this image, there's a huge upfront investment. There are very specialized tools to make modern technologies like this. The chip in this laptop almost certainly came from China or Taiwan, at least. So it is physically difficult to manufacture these hardwares, which has led to a lot of centralization, a lot of it in China, and a lot of it to just a small handful of big tech companies. So the tides are turning. This idea of decentralization is catching on, even in the hardware world where it's difficult to do so. So open designs, specifications, and companies are starting to gain traction. But I'm going to be kind of breezing through hardware because, again, we're at the early stages on open source hardware. Here's a blown out image. Let me just get to the next point here before I start talking about that. And it's there twice. I don't know why. So freedom-oriented hardware you can think of as generally built to last longer, at least, than what we might be used to. So for example, a counterexample to this might be an iPhone, where after several years, the battery life is in software intentionally degraded so that users are encouraged to buy the new model, as opposed to building something that's actually going to last that user a long time. Freedom-oriented hardware is going to generally have more physical access to the components and the designs. So for example, how many people here have a phone or a mobile device that has a removable battery? 3. Okay, so this is something that used to be very common. It's pretty much gone away. You pretty much have a sealed device. You can't change any of the parts in it in most modern hardware. We're starting to swing back the other way now. This is, I believe Fairphone is the name of this company. They offer a removable battery. You can change out the camera module, so you can upgrade this thing to extend the lifespan, as opposed to having an iPhone or some high model Android that when you buy it 2-3 years later, you have to throw it in the trash or recycle it because you can't change the thing at all. Some of the other things that are blown out here is probably, I'm not positive, the image isn't entirely clear to me, but probably like a Bluetooth or a Wi-Fi module. So if some kind of improvement comes along, you can buy the improvement, add it in there, or if it breaks, you can replace it. This is known as, in the industry a lot of times, as right to repair. And generally what right to repair means is that you don't void the warranty by repairing, and it's generally easier, so it's easy enough that an end user can do it. So I mentioned batteries. Another big one is storage. So micro SDs were the standard for quite a while, and then we went to the solid state on-the-board storage, and you're now starting to see some phones that respect freedom a little more that are moving back to that SD card storage that you can expand. So if you run out of space, you store a lot of videos, whatever it is, you can get a bigger SD card. Again, more choice, more free will is offered to the user. This might include something known as hardware switches. And a hardware switch is this idea that the phone might have some capability that you don't want it to do all the time. For example, a microphone, a camera. Like, you might not want the microphone and the camera to be on while you're in the bathroom or while you're having a sensitive conversation with someone, with your doctor, say, something like that. So a hardware switch is a physical switch that might be somewhere on the side of the device that you can turn those things off. If you don't want to be recorded at that time, you know, because you're disconnecting the electricity to that component. And again, you can take the device apart and see the switch goes to this. This will cut off the electricity to it so that it cannot broadcast my GPS position. It cannot record me. It cannot connect to other devices, so on and so forth. And generally, not always, you would at least have the option to run free or open source software. This device is, I believe, a framework laptop. Again, same idea. There are actually only a handful of components to a laptop, even though they look very complex, that you would want to replace as a user. So in the case of this device, I think this whole piece comes out, and that's your CPU. So if you want to get a faster CPU after 2-3 years, you can just pull that device out, or pull that processor out, put your new one in there, and you don't have to replace the entire machine for $2,000 or whatever it is. So CPU, RAM, storage, again, maybe Wi-Fi connectivity cards, things of that nature, and the battery, again, is a big one because those do wear out after time. And you should have the right, as a user of this device, which you own, you should have the right to replace that battery rather than having to buy a whole new device. So one very exciting thing that is coming, this is a little bit nerdy, so I'm not going to get into it too much, but RISC-V is an open instruction set architecture, and what an instruction set is this is how the computer works at the very lowest level. So when electricity is being sent, through logic gates and all these different series of things that allow compute to happen, those architectures have been largely proprietary for decades and decades. And we now have this well-supported open architecture that's being globally worked on so that we can have that instruction set to run on future chips. And those chips are just now starting to come to production now. So that's something to get excited about if you're a nerd like me. These are just some companies that produce open hardware. They may not be entirely free and open source, but they are pushing that direction, or they have the right to repair things like that. So Fairphone Framework makes these laptops. Purism is a device here in America, and Technoethical. I think those other 3 companies are in Europe, which is a little bit ahead of us on this front. Okay, networks and hosting. I'm going to talk about this quite a bit. So the way that a network works generally right now is what's known as a client-server model. So let's take an example that you have some photos. Maybe you took them on your phone. So you've got your phone here, you took some photos, and you want to store those photos and maybe share them with friends. If you use iCloud or a Google account, something of that nature, you're going to be signing into their account after asking their permission to sign in, of course, because it's their server. You're going to store your data. So this is data. This is something that you created. You own this. This is your property. You're going to take your property, and with their permission, you're going to store it on their server. The cloud just means somebody else's computer, by the way. Anytime you hear cloud, someone else's computer. So you're going to store it in the cloud on their computer. And if you want to share it, let's say one of these devices is, grandma. You want to share a photo of your kids with grandma. Then again, you have to ask permission. I want to share this photo with someone else. And then if they grant permission, then that transfer occurs. This is basically how most modern web services work, especially all the free ones. Think Facebook, iCloud, Google Drive, Dropbox, things of that nature. So in this paradigm, most of our data, again, that's our property. If you want to think about this as property, most data lives on servers. Now, obviously, you might have a copy, but generally, you're backing up your data to a server. And generally, big tech companies, or as we went over, GovCorp, owns those servers, which means that they own your data. Now, this is voluntary. You don't have to do this, but it's very convenient to do so. They've made it to where you want to do this. And big tech sell and weaponize that data. They sell it for a profit. In the case of Google, this is basically how they make all their money, is advertising and the selling of your metadata. And largely, these days, we're starting to see a lot more weaponization through companies like Facebook doing psychological experiments and attacks on their users. And if you don't believe that, look that up. They absolutely are fucking with your head. And if you say no, they don't, you want to have an ego about it, and you look at exactly what they're doing, it's gonna have you having trouble sleeping at night. So there's a famous diagram here. This was originally in a manual that was distributed by AT&T. I think it was Ma Bell at the time, or Bell Labs or whatever. And they came out with this idea of centralized, decentralized, and distributed. And you can think of each of these little dots as what we call a node. A node just means a computer, or it might be a human or something like that, depending on what you're applying this model to. So in a centralized model, we have a single node to which all other nodes must connect. You see, there's no other way to get to anyone else without going through that centralized server or that central node. An idea of decentralization, obviously, is to have many central points, right? So if this point goes down, this guy can still go like this and get to someone else if he wants to. And then a distributed model is often called peer-to-peer or P2P. And that means that you're connected to absolutely everyone that you are able to connect to. And so there's a lot of redundancy. In general, we're seeing this move in technology from the left to the right. It is kind of rare to actually get all the way to the right. So if you think about the way that the internet is built, it's basically decentralized already. where each of these nodes are internet service providers. However, those guys might be Comcast or Verizon or someone else that you might not want to trust. And so you would have this desire, if you care about your liberty, to move in this direction towards the distributed model. However, there might be limits to that. So for example, you might not want to drag a fiber optic cable from your house across the ocean to London to talk to somebody in London. You might prefer to pay a centralized party of some kind. But the idea here is to push this direction and to hold those central points of failure to account so that they have some responsibility to the users. So when we're moving further to the right in this model, we have the same thing that I just pointed out. Data still lives on servers, right? So servers are just computers that are serving what you need, right? They're just highly available. It's just a computer that's constantly turned on. There's probably one in this rack right here, but it could even be a laptop. Data still lives on servers, but when we start to move this way with our data, users own the servers, and that means they retain control of their data or their property. And then they share that data, or they share their property with those that they choose to, voluntarily, without being advertised to, without being spied on, surveilled, tracked, so on and so forth. And I'm going to get into this a little bit further here. So there's this idea of quote-unquote self-hosting. It's really just hosting, but when new ideas emerge, we try to like give them new names, and you might think of this as sovereign hosting. It's the same model. We still have a client-server model. But there's a difference here. In a self-hosted quote-unquote model, you own this server. So this might be a little box that sits in your home. It wouldn't have a monitor or anything. It would just sit there, and you would feed it. Say, let's go back to the photos example. You would send your photos to here, to your device at home. It's on 24 hours a day, and if you want to serve it, or if you want to access your photos and share them with grandma again, you would access your own device, ask yourself for permission if you really feel like it, probably not deny yourself permission, and then share that photo directly to another machine. And you might say, why don't we do this already? Generally, convenience, right? So I'll get to that here in a second, actually. So the difference in this model is that the safety of your data and its availability and its redundancy, things of that, become your responsibility, right? So instead of getting a free account with another company that will take care of all this for you, you have to take some responsibility over your devices. And another benefit is that minimal external trust is required. That means other companies, public agencies, so on and so forth. But as a lot of you might be thinking right now, running a server, if you know anything about servers, typically and historically requires systems administration skills, which is nerds like myself that have screens that look like this. And that's hard, right? So why would anyone want to do that? And so I want to do a couple things here, a quick flashback, and then I'm going to give a prediction. It's kind of not really a prediction because it kind of exists already, but I'm going to cheat. Does anybody know what this is? What this is a picture of? It's a very good guess. I wouldn't call it the first, but this is, for those that can't see in the back, this is a room-sized computer. So basically everything that you see here is computer. And there's 4, 5, 6 people in here. I believe this is ENIAC, if I'm not mistaken. I don't think I actually wrote it down. ENIAC, I think, is at University of Penn. So decades and decades ago, to use a computer, period, this was what there was. They were the size of a room. The only way that you were getting in there to even use the thing was if you were in the military, because this particular computer was only used for, or at least at first, was only used for calculating ICBM routes for nuclear missiles. So the only way you were going to get any use on this thing is if you were high-ranking military. This one cost around $6 million in 2021 dollars. So what, 20 million in 2022 dollars? Again, you see there's a handful of experts in this room. These people all would have worked at Penn, and they were all required for the thing just to work. And to use it, you had to physically go to it, and again, you had to have access. You had to be military or university personnel. And what am I giving this presentation on? a computer. Same general idea, right? It's the same technology. It's gotten exponentially better, more powerful, less expensive. We're looking at anywhere from $0 if you're willing to look around or have a friend, or you're willing to put in some time to make something fix, or you're not worried about speed, things like that, up to about $5,000 for a really top-of-the-line machine. And basic operation of this device can be learned in about an hour. There is no expertise really required. There's been psychological experiments where researchers have placed a computer with a solar panel in the middle of a village in India that had no electricity, no concept of what computers were. And the interesting thing was that the adults generally walked by the thing and they were like, well, it's kind of ugly. It's in my way. Don't know why I care about this thing. But the kids flocked to it. And within about 5 minutes, they understand, okay, well, it's got buttons, and it's got this wheel that if I push it, it moves this cursor, it moves this icon, and then I can press on things, right? Whoops. Vitamin B1, damn, I'm telling you. It's got me hype. But yeah, you have these devices that are, we have the power here. Like, I carried here in my backpack something more powerful than what used to be used to calculate nuclear missile routes, and I'm hopefully using it for something a little bit more purposeful than that. And a little prediction here. I should probably rephrase this. It's not really a prediction because it's already happening. Does anyone recognize this image? I'm not going to ask you where it is, and don't ask me where it is because I actually don't know. But this is a data center. And this is a very common way that servers are housed and maintained is in these large buildings with racks of servers. They're actually very similar to this, except they're about 7-8 feet tall, depending. And very serious cooling systems, as you can see here. These are all exhaust fans, most likely, possibly cooling fans. These are built to serve many thousands of users per building here. They cost millions of dollars. They're actually measured in megawatts often because they are built by the spec of how much power they will draw, which also leads to sometimes them being located next to power plants or hydroelectric dams, things of that nature. Again, familiarly, several experts are required for their operation. So expensive. Again, most people probably couldn't sit down and orchestrate how this thing works, even though you could access any of those machines from a laptop. There is a great deal of skill involved here. Can anybody guess what's happening here? Whoops, I got my commercial plug down there too soon. So why do we have to have those big buildings? Why can't we serve our own data, right? So this is a small box, maybe a little bit, roughly the footprint of my laptop, and then a little bit taller, so you could imagine about like yay. And it's a server as well. Now it's owner operated, so whoever purchases this device is the one that is using it. But they might want it for their family, their extended family. They might want it for their small business. They might want it for their church or their community center. Or Liberty on the Rocks might want to serve their own website, for example. Things like this. So they're built to serve between 1 and 100 users, roughly, maybe a little bit more. Again, anywhere from free to about $5,000 to build a very nice one. And again, basic operation can be learned in an hour. So that's, and I'm not going to turn it into a Start9 commercial, but that's essentially what the company I work for does. You can check out start9.com if you want to learn a little bit more about what we're doing in that area. Let's talk about operating systems now. So first of all, what's an operating system? Let me see, I forgot what I wrote here. So, okay, so operating system is the main software interface between the user and the machine, right? So we have here in the middle, it says operating system, and then we have all our hardware devices, so our mouse and keyboard, our printer maybe, our monitor, storage drives, the computer itself. The operating system is what ties all of this together, and this is the piece that the user actually interacts with. So when you turn your computer on, this is what is loaded. Not quite first, but as far as our purposes here, it's essentially loaded first. And manages everything that you interact with. So it's responsible for managing the hardware, as shown in this image, file operations and storage, system security, networking, the managing of processes and applications, memory allocation, things of that nature. Some common examples: Android, BSD, not really common, iOS, GNU Linux, Mac OS, and Windows. Probably everyone in here has used at least one of those, if I had to guess. Let's go through a very quick operating system history. I'm not going to dive into this too far, but basically everything you see up until here has a common ancestor in what is known as Unix. So that is where most operating systems were born from, except for Microsoft, who have to be different, and they have their own line of operating systems that they produced that originated in the MS-DOS software. So when we look at the Unix tree, we have from that comes what eventually turned into Mac, so OS X and iOS. We have what eventually turned into kind of embedded systems, research systems, and other open software, and the Linux kernel, which birthed some things that people may not have realized, such as Android, Chrome OS, and the rest are all flavors of Linux, I think. So what is Linux? Because that's what I'm going to focus on here. They have a cute penguin, first of all, which is important to have a cute logo, I think. Start9 really needs one. So you might see there's constantly, I don't know if anyone's familiar with the idea of bickering occurring in freedom communities. It happens in the tech world as well. So there are many terms you might see OSS or FOSS or FLOSS. You might see these acronyms tossed around. I went ahead and put all of it. I put it all up here. So if you see any of these terms, what this stands for, the F is free, Libre, open source software. So often it's just OSS or free OSS or things of that nature. So just to break that down, actually, because this seems redundant, right? Free and Libre. So free generally means that the code is available. In the case of Linux, Linux is software. So when we're talking about the designs or the recipes that make up Linux, we're talking about software code. So free generally means that code is publicly available. So anyone can audit that, they can view it, they can understand how this software is running. Libre typically tends to mean that you can do whatever you want with it. So that might mean that you can take that code and you can use it to run a company and sell a product for profit. There are no restrictions is typically what Libre means. And then open source is the term that I covered earlier, which is kind of the idea of this publicly available thing that people can use and edit as they wish. Sometimes this is another nerdy infighting thing. Sometimes you'll hear this referred to as GNU Linux. GNU is just a set of operating system tools. It was actually around first. And Linux is the kernel, which is a massive piece of that, of an operating system. Most everyone in here has probably used Linux. So this might be in the gas pump. This might be in the credit card machine. This Linux is run on most of the world's servers. So anytime you access Google or Facebook or any of these cloud services, they are almost certainly running on Linux. There are some exceptions. Microsoft runs a lot of its stuff on Windows servers, for example. When using it personally, there are endless options and customization for the needs or desires of anyone. And I'm going to kind of fly through what some of those are in a minute here. I really like this quote. It's attributed to Albert Camus, or Camus. I don't know who this is, but Camus, thank you. I'm glad someone knows it. Someone in here knows that, since I don't. The only way to deal with an unfree world is to become so absolutely free that your very existence is an act of rebellion. That's why I use Linux. Any questions? No. So again, sorry, this is probably hard to read. This benefits, so when designs and computer code specifically are publicly available, it benefits from the eyes of the entire community rather than just one company, the way proprietary software typically is. And it benefits in that if there's a mistake, it is more likely to be seen. So if you pay Let's say you pay 100 people to look at your software code and to ensure there are no bugs or security holes or problems or user experience problems. They're going to find some stuff. But if you have a community of 10,000 people that are looking at something, they're going to see it from absolutely every angle. So you're going to get the benefits of people having had eyes on this thing for a long time and understanding its pitfalls and fixing them gradually as they find them. Freedom. You fully own the software that you're running when you run Linux. And you may decide to do whatever you wish or do not wish to do with that. So there are no restrictions to speak of. Security, again, I kind of mentioned that with the more eyes-on type of thing. Open source software, and Linux in particular, are routinely the most well-maintained and robust software, and they generally aren't like sucking down your data, tracking or advertising to you, surveilling you, things of that nature. Personalization and customization, you can make it yours. And it'll only bother you if you ask it to, right? It's not going to shove notifications in your face. If you want to turn those off, you can turn those off. Many of you might have a Mac or a Windows machine that won't, shut the fuck up. I can curse in here, right? A lot of Linux distributions are lightweight. So if you have an old computer, I was talking earlier about you can get a computer these days for free if you look around hard enough. Linux is probably what you want to put on that free computer because it's not going to be able to run modern Windows or modern Mac operating systems because they're so damn heavy. Like they put so much shit in there that you can't run it on an old machine. And that's, again, by design because they want you to buy the new thing, right? And community. There's unmatched community when it comes to open source software. I mean, people care about the thing that they're using because they don't have to go and get a job somewhere to feel like they're a part of it, and they're not doing it because they're doing it as a job. They're doing it because they love it. So if you want support, it's kind of like Bitcoin or being vegan or something. Like the person's going to let you know real quick. I use Linux, by the way. Do you want to know all about it? CrossFit. There you go. Interoperability. There are thousands of applications, just like you would expect. Of any modern computing device, anything that you want this to do that your current device does, it'll do it, for sure. And as I said, you're already using this. It's running a lot of the embedded systems in our world today. Okay, distributions. I'm going to kind of start flying through this because, as I said, this was originally a Linux presentation, and I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here. And I know I'm already at, 40, 50 minutes? Okay, so there are, that's all screwed up. There are all kinds of Linux distributions. Here are a handful of the most popular. The very most popular is probably Ubuntu. But again, these are all related. I don't know if anyone noticed in the history. With a distribution is just like a flavor. You can think of it as a type of Linux. So whereas with Windows and Mac, they typically have one distribution. They have one style or flavor that they're producing. With Linux, there's different strokes for different folks, as it were, right? So most of these are general use. Some of them are like Red Hat is more for commercial use. A lot of people would use something like Gentoo for scientific or research purposes, or because they just love compiling software because they're that kind of nerd. You generally want to keep it simple. Just find the thing that's going to work for you and use that. Any popular distribution of Linux is going to serve well as a multi-purpose operating system, so your general daily use. So consider your main use case. And if it's just email, browse the web, then go with a popular one like Ubuntu. You can test drive Linux before you install. It's free to use, so you can just grab it off the internet, install it to your computer, or even use a flash drive to test it out and see if you like it first. And you're going to find it's very similar to what you're probably already using, but you can get a feel for it and understand how it goes. And there are specialized distributions for gaming, for kids, for hacking, for experimentation, for science. Anything you can think of probably has its own distribution. There's a very high level of customization in Linux. It's highly modular. Again, I'm not going to dive too far into this, but there are different desktop environments, window managers. These are just components to an operating system. You can make it look super totally elite like this, or you can just have it, you can make it look dead on exactly like Microsoft Windows. There are software packages that make it look like Windows because people desire that. But themes, so a desktop environment is what you're generally interacting with. Again, keep it simple. Here's a few of the popular ones. GNOME is very popular. KDE comes with everything you could think of, and some are more lightweight, like XFCE, that you might want to put on an older machine. You can also have no desktop environment if you just like being in a command line. I don't recommend that if you've never done it before. Again, like I said, you can just throw this on a USB stick. You flash it on there, stick it in the computer. I'm happy to run anyone through this that needs a hand with it. I'm happy to make myself available for that. You can find me in the, what's it called? Telegram. That's that thing that I talk on too much. Of course. Of course, yeah.
Just kind of like I'm thinking if I'm asking this question, and probably so do other people, if you were to back up 2 slides,
Sure.
You had the different flavors and the different OS kind of packages,
Mm-hmm.
and what you were saying was that they come with like a different package of things with the kitchen sink. There's a stripped down version, so on and so forth.
Oh, you mean this one here?
Yeah, that one, the different environments. Can you actually describe what that actually means, like what the kitchen sink is to you in the way that you're describing it?
Yeah, so the question is like, what's the difference here? And again, if you're thinking about your use case and it's just general purpose, I want to compute, I want to do word processing and spreadsheets and browse and use email and things like that, then you probably don't need to think too much about this because they're all going to include like the things that you would expect. So like notifications, like you have an email or your hard drive is full of crap, or whatever it is. They're all going to see. So you see here different styles of what are known as launchers. So you see like this is kind of like a Mac style. So this is a personal. Basically, it's a personal preference. So if you're coming from a Mac, you might prefer a desktop environment that's clean, has a dock here with all your applications, and then has a top bar because that's what you're used to. So you might prefer to go with something like that. You might say, I just want some icons on the desktop. I don't want a launcher. I don't want any bars. Then you might go with something like this. And I'm actually not even positive which of these is which, to be perfectly honest, because they're very configurable. So you can make any of those look like any of these.
On the left side where it says like GNOME, KDE,
Mm-hmm.
Cinnamon, are those like actual like the different OS compilation that you download and install, or is it just like a configurable package that you would use with an app?
Okay, so the question here is basically, so the previous page which had Ubuntu and Gentoo and Kubuntu and things like that, those are distributions of Linux or types or flavors of Linux. These are what's known as desktop environments, which is what you're actually looking at. So you can load any of these onto any of those. Everything is very, very modular. It's like endlessly customizable. I've wasted way too much time on it, so that's why my advice is constantly to keep it simple. Like, if someone says I use this and it's great, and someone else says I use this and it's great, we'll try them both out real quick, and whichever one instantly does what you need it to do, just go ahead and go with that one. 'Cause you can always change. You can always swap these out. So if you install KDE and you hate it, you can move to GNOME. Or if Ubuntu comes with GNOME, and you're like, well, I didn't want to use Ubuntu because it didn't like quite do this thing that I wanted, well, maybe you might want to install a different desktop environment because it might do some things that you prefer.
All right, so then the previous page that had the different packages, those are the ones that you would actually download and install as opposed to the other.
Yeah, so these are the operating system proper. These are Linux. Linux itself is the kernel, which is a very integral or important part of the operating system, but these are the operating system on the whole. Okay, and this is almost. I almost regret showing how many options there are because it's probably can be overwhelming. So again, there are a handful of very, very popular distributions for people to start on. Again, Ubuntu. I highly recommend Linux Mint. If you've never used Linux before, it's a very similar experience to Windows. But you might prefer, someone might tell you, oh, I came from a Mac and I went to blah, and I found it the best. You might want to try that because you might be coming from a Mac. So it's difficult for me to give advice because it's highly customizable and it's tailored to the needs of individuals. So hopefully this isn't too overwhelming, but the gist here is there are endless options. So look at the very most popular ones, because again, those are going to have the most support, the most community behind them, and just go with one of those. And if you do want recommendations from me, I'm happy to give those after the talk here as well. But generally, Ubuntu, Linux Mint, you can't go wrong with either of those. And that's Mint, M-I-N-T, as in a breath mint. As I mentioned, you can test drive these. You can even run these on your current machine. So Mac, for example, has a couple of programs you can run, Parallels or Boot Camp, which actually let you run Linux inside of your MacBook. So you can actually fire up Linux inside your MacBook as it stands today, and you can kind of poke around in there and say, oh, okay, I kind of like this, I might want to try it, or I don't know if this is for me yet, and I want to keep using my Mac. You can use VirtualBox on basically any operating system to test drive Linux or any other operating system. So again, you can play around with these things without having to actually wipe your computer and dedicate your machine to it. Also, if you have an old machine, that's another good place to be. Software. So this is where we are spoiled right now. We've come a long way in the open source movement in software, or what you can think of as generally as applications. So a lot of this will be familiar to folks. Firefox, Chromium, Android, all of these are open source options that people can use. So software is everything above the hardware level, essentially, roughly. This can be anything from taking notes, playing games, controlling other machines, like a drone or something like that. This is the stuff that you're very used to interacting with on a daily basis. This is the quote-unquote easiest thing for open source engineers to develop because software is very inexpensive in comparison to research and development for hardware. And it's a huge movement. As I said earlier, Linux is running most of the world's servers, a lot of its embedded systems, POS machines, things of that nature. Open communications protocols, a lot of the internet is run on open protocols that are available for anyone that we understand very well. This slide, there's no way around it. You might want to just take a picture. I'm going to tell you that right now, and it's very difficult to read, unfortunately. I didn't know that was going to come out like that. I'm happy to provide these slides as well, or provide this list to anyone that wants it. Just ask me afterwards, or maybe there's somewhere I can put. I'll throw it in the Telegram, actually. At least a picture of this. I promise I'll throw this in the Telegram. I'm just going to blast through this. The idea here is that there is any kind of software that you're using right now, there is an open source alternative, and at this point in the movement, I'm comfortable saying that it is a good alternative. There was a time not that long ago where that was not the case. For example, if you use Photoshop every day, there was not a good Photoshop alternative for a very long time. Now there is with GIMP or Inkscape, Blender. People use that stuff all the time. So for example, for an Office suite, instead of Microsoft Office or whatever it is Mac people use, you might use LibreOffice. And you can use, an important thing to mention, you can use any of this generally on any machine. So if you're already running Windows or Mac and you don't want to change to Linux, you can run all of this stuff now. And I believe everything on here is free of cost. So pretty sure everything on here is free of cost. There might be premium versions, but everything's at least free for general use. For a cloud suite, instead of something like OneDrive or Google Suite, you might use something like Nextcloud or Hubzilla. I know there's some people in here that are running those already. For your browser, instead of Safari or Microsoft Edge, which is basically Chrome at this point, you could use Firefox. For email, Thunderbird is a great client. For messengers, instead of using something like Telegram or iMessage, I think that's what it's called on iPhone, you could use open protocols like Matrix or XMPP. The clients for those, popular clients for those are Element and Pigeon. And because this stuff is open and customizable, it's the same thing. You're going to see lots of choices with a handful of really popular ones at the top that I would recommend starting with. And I'm not going to go through the rest, but I will, again, I'll post this in Telegram so that folks have this. Because I think it's a good starting point to understand that anything that you use that is like not under your control, that you don't fully own it, can be replaced with something that you do fully own that respects your freedoms, your right to do things with that software because you own it. I wanted to briefly touch on a technology that's not dealing with compute. Again, this idea extends everywhere. Like I said, recipes, roads, anything like how to build a chair, all this stuff, open source applies to this. It's just like freedom respecting is what we're getting at here. So just to touch briefly on money, just as an example of that, most of us today are using the US dollar, euro, ruble, whatever state we happen to be in. These are all closed source or proprietary. They're centrally controlled in regards to policy and creation. They are always used as a proxy, meaning that the piece of paper that these appear on doesn't have any value. It is a proxy for value, right? So you're going to exchange one of these for something that you want, gasoline or a service or a computer, whatever it is. It's not actually valuable in and of itself. These can be used to fund wars and God knows what else. So again, they're based in control. That's where the foundations, the principles of these state-backed monies are in control. So alternatives to that. I'm sure there's Bitcoin folks in here, but it could be ammunition. It could be barter and trade for a service or for a good that you produce or something that you don't want anymore. It could be food. My favorite currency probably is seeds. Those are going to be important soon. We're seeing our food supply get attacked at this point. These are based on open markets, and their designs are typically open or peer-to-peer. We can now share across the internet a CAD file of how to 3D print firearms, right? So there is no limit to any of this anymore. Like freedom is now, it's always been ours for the taking, so to speak, but like there's not an excuse anymore. All the tools, all the modern tools, every convenience you can imagine can be produced in a freedom-oriented way. Now these are sometimes a proxy. For example, something like Bitcoin or Monero might be a proxy. You might want to just trade that. Some people I know will probably argue with me and say, it's inherently valuable. Like, okay, yeah, I can make that argument, but it's ones and zeros, right? You're not going to eat it. Same thing as the paper. But more importantly, it's voluntary, right? These are all voluntary. Anything that you're going to trade is your choice to use. It's your money. It's what you're using it how you want to use it. Which I basically just said. And again, these are based in principle. They're based in freedom. Freedom. Migration. So this is the practical 2 minutes of at the end here. Is how do we get there? Does anybody know what this image is? 2 or 3 people. Very cool. This is the number 1 major arcana card from a tarot deck, or from a traditional tarot deck known as the Rider-Waite deck. This is the Magician. And the Magician means mastery of the tools at his disposal. And these are generally considered the 4 elements, which are described on the table in front of him and in his hand. So this is an individual who has used what's around him to bring himself to the highest level of consciousness. So the migration to sovereignty, the escaping, well, I put it better here. This is an individual's path, right? So all action starts with an individual, and that individual's path leads to the greater good. But it has to start with the individual. We have to there ain't nobody coming to help you. Oh, here, I'm going to give you some more freedom. It's not going to happen that way. Every individual has to take this initiative, and that doesn't mean that there aren't people there to help. There are tons of people there to help. I'm here to help you. If this was completely confusing the last hour to you, I am happy to break it down in whatever way is meaningful to you and help you take the steps from where you're at. generally, this is moving, in regards to the technologies I was just talking about, this is moving away from slavery, and often that slavery is of convenience, right? The free Google account, the free Facebook account. Everybody's doing it. Everybody, you gotta have it too. And towards freedom. And freedom, there's no separation here in my opinion. And maybe someone can make an argument against this, but in my opinion, taking responsibility is prerequisite to freedom. Again, it's not the easy road. It has to be worked for. Patience is the number one requirement when you're thinking about doing this stuff. Again, if this is overwhelming, first step, like, okay, I use Microsoft Edge, and there's an option over here that respects my freedom. Can I switch? Can I at least try it out and see if it does the things that I do on a daily basis? Can I try Firefox instead and see if it does the things that I need? So move at your own pace. It's a marathon, not a sprint. You start where you are with what you have available to you. If you don't have any money and you don't have a computer, again, find the free option, the hand-me-down, whatever it is, and then use the free software tools that will work with it to do the things that you need to do. Like many of life's journeys, this journey may never end. I learn something new every single day, and that can be very frustrating. It can be very depressing when you see the state of things and you realize, like, oh man, just to understand and use the tools that I need to affect change in the world, it's like looking up at Mount Everest. You know, I'm down here at base camp, like, I don't know if I can do that. Well, you can't do it if you don't take the first step, which is on flat ground, you know. So take that first step. I've found in my life planning and goals to be immensely useful. And all that means is just write something down. Write something down. They call it spelling for a reason, right? You're casting a spell. You're creating something in the world by writing it down. And again, the easiest way to start is in software. This is kind of just an example. It's not a rule. But the easiest way to start is in software, because you might already have a phone or a computer that runs some software that doesn't respect your freedom. And that's the easiest move, is to change that software that you're using. And then maybe you move to a different operating system. You try out Linux, and then host your own server, and then maybe change your money. So for example, getting Firefox is easy. Getting Linux is a little bit less easy. Living without a bank, less and less easy. But it is possible, and your friends are here to help you. So that's all I got. I really appreciate your kind attention today, and I'm happy to take any questions that we have time for.
Thank you. That was very helpful, and appreciate your offer for more information. Can you tell me what's the best and simplest way to describe what the kernel is?
Oh man. I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer that, to be perfectly honest. It's a key component of an operating system that kind of, to the best of my understanding, orchestrates the operating system. So without diving into like what an operating system does on a lower level, and without greater knowledge personally of how kernels operate, I don't feel qualified to answer that. I don't want to give you an incorrect answer. But you can just think of it as the core software within an operating system. Thank you. Sure, yeah. Perfectly fine. Yeah, perfectly fine. I'm happy to back them up if folks want to come up and take a picture of any of these as well.
Hi, Dave. Thank you very much for a great presentation. Not being a big computer guy, just pretending on TV. What about safety and security? I mean, a lot of us worry about that, and we figure that when we're moving from these other operating systems into new operating systems, that we might give up some safety and security of our information. What do you have to say with that on Linux?
Yeah, so specifically in regard to Linux, you're moving from, let's use the examples of Mac and Windows. You're moving, again, from systems that were formulated, designed, and created with the basis, with a base level understanding of typically of making profit, not of respecting your freedom, right? So they take shortcuts. Sometimes they intentionally include things that we might consider malicious to our security, such as trackers, location. They might collect location data. On average, Microsoft and Apple devices are going to constantly be phoning home, which is a term that we use for sending data from a device that you ostensibly own, sending data from that machine in your how you use it, what's on it, so on and so forth, to those companies, right? Linux, there is no company that it's, there are Linux companies that produce flavors of Linux that can do this, but generally the home use Linux distributions, there is no company that they're sending anything back to, right? You can sometimes optionally give data that's helpful to developers that's anonymized, and they will always, or at least mostly, ask for your permission to do that. So even when they say, we would like some anonymous data, usage data of how your machine is working with our software so that we can improve the software, they will often ask and say, is this okay with you if we collect it? And here's what we collect, as opposed to Microsoft and Apple, who are going to say, we're collecting all of this. You signed the terms of service that was 73 pages long. You read that right, because that turned over basically all of the software property on your device belongs to us, according to that. So there's actually a big leap in the positive direction for security and privacy when you go to a system like Linux, because it is based in freedom and privacy respecting principles.
I'm curious what you think about infiltration by the state into some of the software. I'm thinking OpenSSL, for instance. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so the question is about the infiltration even of open systems, right? So you mentioned OpenSSL. This is a protocol for establishing a secure connection between machines. And the problems of government intervention externally don't go away. So there's two things that I want to speak to on that. The first is that, first of all, they are external. When you use a system built by Microsoft or Apple, they are 100%, I promise you, guaranteed, them and Google and Facebook and all them, 100%, these three-letter alphabet boys, all these guys have offices in their buildings, okay? So the infiltration is complete. It is 100%, they are there, period. They are giving helpful hints and additions into that software, whether we like it or not. In addition, they're attacking it externally. They're poking around looking for weaknesses, and then they're not disclosing those in a responsible way. Now, when we go to the open source, the second point here is, as I said, that's available for anyone to look at the software, right? So there is no protection via secrecy that is a common argument for proprietary software or hardware. So there's no protection via secrecy, but the protection comes from having more eyes on it. So if there is, if I listed here the instructions of how some particular program was built, the computer code, we could all see it, and there might be, two people in the room that say, well, I see a problem right up there in line 3 or whatever it is. Now, one of them might say, I want to use that problem to, I want to exploit that weakness to spy on users of the software. But maybe the other person that notices that says, I'm going to disclose that, meaning I'm going to tell the developers of the software there's a problem in line 3, and if a bad actor found out about that problem, they could use your software to spy on people, and then the developers can correct that. So the problem doesn't go away, but the ability to respond in a meaningful way to the problem is distributed amongst the users in the community to fix that. And if there aren't many eyes on the software, if there's a piece of software that almost no one uses, it can be considered weaker because there's not very many people looking at it and understanding it. So an attacker could exploit that. But if it's widely used, like Linux or Firefox or WordPress, things, well, WordPress is a terrible example actually because the plugin architecture is a mess. But generally, popular open source software has more eyes on it, and the weaknesses are discovered and fixed very rapidly.
Hey, thanks for being here. Does all software that run on Linux have to be open source for it to run?
No.
No. Okay. So then, does an increase in the user base of Linux put some subtle market pressures on the software developers to port their popular software over to Linux? And is it difficult to port such software for the main software developers that are out there?
Yeah, so the increased popularity of these tools definitely puts pressure for developers to have, say, open source options, even if they don't want to open their software entirely. So there's a lot of examples now of companies that have been producing proprietary software for a long time, suddenly creating what's known as when a piece of software is edited and two versions are created from that original piece. There's two edits. That's known as a fork. And the reason is that it looks like a fork. It branches off. And there are now several instances of this proprietary software having an open source fork created by the owners of the proprietary software, such that they can see what happens when the open source community gets a hold of an open version, right? So they might hold some trade secrets in this version, but open up the base code. And you see this, so for example, earlier I showed the image over here with the Android and the Penguin and the Chromium, and some of you are very used to using Google Chrome, and you'll see that the colors were a little different. Google Chrome is proprietary to Google, so there are things in Google Chrome that you are not permitted to read, and it is based on Chromium, which is completely open source and available for anyone to read. So that base software Google releases out to the community to help catch security bugs, which speaks again to the previous question, while keeping some proprietary, competitive advantage over their competitors in the Google Chrome instance. So yes, is the answer there.
Hi, is it possible to be all open source right now? Like, if I wanted to buy a computer or a laptop, I could buy that open source one. I could get the software, and somehow I could also connect to the internet and have that all open, all just available to me, no one else, or unless I had some other friends that I wanted to link up with. Can you do that now?
Yeah. So the short answer is yes. The hardware is the hardest part. So if you go to a company, for example, earlier I mentioned a company called Purism. They do sell a laptop which they've gone all the way down to the hardware level and the firmware in there, and they've worked to open that up and make the designs and such available. So that's kind of the hardest part, is the hardware. Once you have the hardware and you get Linux or some other open source operating system on there, it's not trivial, but you can put only open source software on your machine, and lots of people are very strict about the stuff that they run on there. I do my best to run only open source software. I would imagine I have a few little proprietary things sprinkled in there, but it's not much. But it is possible. Now, when you talk about connecting to the internet, and can you connect to only open stuff on the internet, the answer there is probably that's going to be a lot harder. So if you're only using an open protocol to connect to a friend of yours that is only using, again, the same setup, open source hardware and software, and you're communicating over an open protocol, then probably. But again, your signal is going from, say I was connected to the Wi-Fi here, my signal would travel through a computer that belonged to the internet service provider for this building. Let's say it was Comcast. So it has to travel through that computer. Now, likely that computer is running Linux, but you don't really know what they're using to, what software they're using to transmit your signal. So unless you have a direct connection through Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, drag a cable to your neighbor's house, whatever it is, it's a little bit more difficult. But again, these open standards are so robust that a lot of large companies run entirely, not entirely, but largely on open systems as well. So the short answer is yes, but there are a lot of moving parts there.
Hello. Thank you so much for coming, first of all, and for the talk. My question is a little regarding the hardware side of things and the centralization and decentralization slide. in which you had data warehouse, and the prediction was personal server computers. My question is around kind of like, I don't see how the economics of that works out, right? Because like cloud solutions are, they're pretty cheap, and the services that they provide, and they're able to do that because of economies of scale, right? So I'm just wondering if you had any insight in like how the economics of that works out, or is, in my opinion, like a centralized solution will always be cheaper.
Yeah, that's a terrific question. So the gist of the question here is, with economies of scale and with these points of centralization, don't you gain a lot of efficiency and therefore cheaper costs, which then can be passed down to the user? And in a lot of cases, that's the case. Again, my example of dragging a fiber optic cable across the ocean floor, for example, is probably going to be a lot cheaper and best left to a contractor that owns a boat, for one. A boat is a useful tool in that endeavor, things of that nature. But when it comes to distributing the idea of data centers into the home, that is actually this is a industry that's getting ready to blow up, because what's going to happen is this idea of holding your own data and then being able to share it amongst other servers is actually going to work out better. Like, you may be able to, yes, as a company, have a big building that serves lots and lots of people, and that will be done cheaply. But let's look at, so say for an example, you want to host a terabyte of data, photos or whatever it is, with some cloud service. Today that might be, $3-5 a month or whatever it is. And so you have this recurring subscription fee. Whereas if you buy a 1 terabyte hard drive, depending on the style and type that you're getting, it might be $50. Now, you need a machine to put it in, and so on and so forth. But what I'm getting at here is that you're going to buy this device one time. It's going to be upgradable, so you can improve it, you can repair it yourself, so on and so forth. And there is no subscription fee. And furthermore, that subscription fee is subject to change, like inflation, or the company just needs to make a little more money here, or they see market conditions and the war in Russia. They're going to come up with reasons to like up that price. So we're going to see, I think, this is not 100% the case. Do your own research, make your own predictions, but I think that hosting your own data is going to be cheaper in the long term than using a subscription service. But that's something I'm going to say that's open to debate, but that is my personal opinion, is that will be the case. At Start9, we actually not foresee, but we kind of expect that we will end up being cheaper than using a cloud service, and more powerful, flexible, freedom respecting, so on and so forth. But yeah, great question.
Hi, do you have an opinion on Valve and what they've done with Steam and Steam OS and all of that move that they're going in that direction?
When you ask, like, do I have an opinion on that, I don't know a great deal about Valve. These are gaming companies. I don't know a great deal about them. I would assume that your question is in regard to DRM.
Yeah, I mean, that's the common barrier for gaming and things like that, but it's a big leap for Valve to have created their own operating system just to better run their games rather than relying on Windows. Mm-hmm. And so they have all this hardware out for it and all this whole thing. So I don't know. I sort of saw them as a big player pushing in the open source direction. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know if you had comments about them or other companies doing anything sort of similar like that, or.
Yeah. Again, I don't know a great deal about Valve and Steam. What I do know about them is that they are certainly helping to popularize this idea. So there's a couple of sort of holdouts in the open source world, and a common one is the computer gamer, because the computer gamer is used to hardware that has been specialized to Windows specifically in most cases. And so they've been sort of hesitant. They've been sort of the last ones that have interest in, and them and creators, I would say, video editing. And those two kind of holdouts, we're now starting to see that the open source options are not only reaching parity with the proprietary solutions, but in some cases they're beginning to outperform or be more efficient or be better in user experience or whatever it is. So it is my opinion that we're kind of reaching the point of parity or passing the point of parity with proprietary systems of even the most ardent holdouts such as the gaming community. So I think, hopefully that gives you one of my opinions, but I don't know much about the gaming world, so that's as much as I can speak to that.
Thanks.
Question. What are your top 3 applications that you would consider unicorn applications? So in terms of the best applications for privacy, security, ease of use, maybe even cost, what would you rank as the 3 best?
Did someone say Bitcoin? Bitcoin's a big deal. I could talk for another 3 hours about Bitcoin. Some people make the argument, and I like this argument, that the internet was not finished until Bitcoin was created because you could not pass value in an open way, the way that you can pass data in every other way across the internet. So I'm going to say Linux and Bitcoin are the biggest, most powerful open source projects, in my opinion. Most other important open source projects, I don't know if I want to say most. I do want to say most. Most are either built for or built on Linux, right? So for example, the product that we actually build at Start9 is an operating system based on Linux, okay? And most of these softwares, even though they might run on all platforms, will run on Linux. So, and like I said, the world runs on Linux. Your gas pump, your TV, your, there's power supplies, for God's sake, that have Linux on them. Like, I'm not even sure why, but they do. So Linux is definitely, Linux and Bitcoin would be my answer to that question.
With the rise of home servers, would you expect to see a lot of easy turnkey VPN connections between those servers?
That's a great question. So a VPN, for those that don't know, it's an acronym, stands for Virtual Private Network. And what this generally means is that you have an encrypted connection from your computer to some other computer or group of computers that is private because it's encrypted. So for example, a lot of people will be familiar with the idea of connecting to an office VPN. That means that you're on your company's network even if you're working from home, let's say. And the question was, with the rise of home servers, will that become more prevalent? We certainly at Start9 believe that, and we expect that in the future, these devices, since they'll be connecting to each other with open protocols, it is extremely cheap and therefore makes a lot of sense that those connections be encrypted, and that you start to see these encrypted networks of home servers, even if they're not running our software, that they use these open protocols to connect to each other in such a way that anyone else that sees the traffic, such as an internet service provider, can't read it. They can see what you're doing. So for example, currently we use Tor. They can see that you're using the Tor network, but where you're going and what you're doing on the Tor network is shielded from them because it's encrypted by default. And so we sort of foresee a future, and this actually ties back to the question on cost. So you have this idea of like, first of all, I want a copy of my data that's not in my house, right? Because what if the house burns down? That's a problem. So I want a copy of my data somewhere else, but I don't want to give it to a company and have to ask their permission to get it back. So what can you do when everybody has these open systems that they're running is you can take that data, you can break it up, which is known as sharding, and you can encrypt it. So you can encrypt the whole thing, break it down into little tiny pieces, and you can spread it. You can scatter it like to the winds, and put it on all these other volunteers or all these other volunteers in the network, put it on their machines. And they're going to put a little bit of it on your machine maybe. And some people will have more data that they need to store, and they might pay. They might make a micro payment over the Lightning Network, for example, fractions of a penny per week or something. And if you have a large hard drive and you don't fill it up, you might get paid to store those little chunks of data. And you can't read that data. You can't put that data together in a meaningful way such that you know what it is. So there is no three-letter agency knocking your door down and being like, hand over the fucking gun CAD files, we know you got them. You'll be like, I actually don't have any idea what I have. Here's the drive, you figure it out, you know? And they're gonna have to attack that with a supercomputer for a chance at knowing what's on there, and they're gonna find a fraction of the data, not the whole thing. So they're not gonna actually have it. Furthermore, that data hasn't been stolen from the original owner because they spread it all over the network. So it's a really, really powerful idea, and that's another huge benefit of a distributed system.
What happens to that piece that was removed from the network?
So because that, so that's a piece, but that piece is stored redundantly, right? So there might be, so let's say I take a file and I chop it into 10 pieces, and I distribute those 10 pieces to 10 computers. Well, I'm actually going to distribute to 10 computers and then take a copy of each to another 10 computers and a copy of each to another 10 computers. And it might be configurable, or there'll probably be some sensible default to it. But the idea here is that, excuse me, if one of those 10 computers goes down and you've only distributed 10 chunks, or 10 out of 10 pieces, and a computer goes down, well, then you're left with 9/10 of your data. So you need redundant copies out there, right? So, but the beauty of there being tons and tons of computers is that there's plenty of opportunity for redundancy. So if someone's computer goes down, they turn it off, there's a lightning strike, power outage, FBI, whatever, it doesn't matter because your data is geo-redundantly spread across the network.
Last question.
Hey, what type of license do you guys use at Start9 for your software, and why'd you choose that one?
Mm-hmm. So licensing is an interesting topic. The idea of a license is that, and there are endless arguments, again, bickering, infighting about different types of licenses. A license is something that the author puts on their software and says, you may use this in this way. And in order to be considered an open source or a Libra or a free license, there are criteria that need to be met, and there'll be some fighting about what that criteria and what the definitions mean and all this. But then anyway, that's the idea of a license. Now at Start9 we have a license which is completely open for personal use, meaning you can go to the repository where our code is kept, you can download that, compile it, and use it on your machine in any way that you'd like. But there is a restriction in the Start9 license to commercialization. So the only thing that we restrict in that license is the ability to distribute the precompiled code from yourself to others. And typically that's going to mean for commercial purposes. So the only thing that is restricted in that license is basically that you cannot sell the software that we produce. Now, there are a lot of internal discussions about that license, and a lot of us, myself included, err on the side of how do you enforce a license, right? So if someone in here takes our license and they decide that they're going to start selling it to somebody, what is our recourse? Well, the recourse is the state, right? Because the legal system is the recourse. And really the argument from my opponents in this debate is that the defense is actually the threat, not the actual use of the legal system. But my personal opinion is, well, if it's just a facade, drop it, let's not have a license. My personal favorite license is called the BIPCOT license, and it is a license that states that the software is free for any purpose or use, with the exception of anyone who is an agency of government or an agent of government, and that if any agent of government uses it for any purpose, then they are agreeing to be publicly shamed for using it. So I personally, I'm an anarchist. I feel that any kind of writing or piece of paper that requires the state to enforce is nonsense. My personal opinion. And that opinion is welcome at Start9, but it is not the majority opinion, so we carry the non-commercial license.
Do you run into any issues with that?
Yeah, me. I mean, like, I have a problem with it. I'm probably the loudest proponent of getting rid of it, but I also can argue their side. I understand. It's a fledgling company, small startup, and the idea is to protect against a company like Amazon scooping up the software and selling it. So that's basically the defense. But as far as problems, there have been problems from people that don't use a license like that. Particularly, one famous instance in the Bitcoin world is a company called I forget the name of the actual company, but they produce the cold card hardware wallet. They've had a couple of companies now basically rip their code and use it to create a new company with changes. Now, that's what your license said that they could do with it. So, they've now changed to a non-commercial license. So licenses like the one Start9 has are actually kind of getting a little popular. But again, I fall on the other side of the argument personally. But it's, difference of opinion.
That's our talk. Give it up for Dave.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.